I will start now. Okay, well, we've only 6 minutes off the time, and I'm sure, well, no train driver is going to deny you, Andrew, are they? We're very pleased to have Lord Adonis at what is the 88th meeting of the Myling Group. The Twitter tweeting tag is at Myling Group, if you'd like to include that. So welcome, my name's John Davis, I'm the director of the Myling Group. The Myling Group exists really largely because of our friendship with Hewlett-Packard, now in its 9th year. So a big thank you to them, and tonight's event is also co-sponsored by the Sir John Cass Foundation. A big thank you to them. Tonight we have what the Times call New Labour's Action Man. I quite like that. Hatchet Man or something like that. I quite like. I'm sure you're aware, Andrew, that Michael Gove's been speaking about you this afternoon. The line between those who welcome the future and those who oppose it is not drawn along party lines. One man who has always been on the side of the future is the great Labour reformer, Andrew Adonis. Andrew's recent book, Education, 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 is something I recommend to anyone who has not yet read it. Now, we're very fond of Andrew at the Myling Group. He is, of course, a member of our advisory board. But I've got to tell you, the book is wonderful. I think it's just, it's so fast-paced. Wonderful. And there'll be plenty of copies outside that Andrew will sign. From the book, there's also, one of the things that I was trying to put into words very, very quickly was what I thought of the book. I was looking for a quote, and I found one line. There is no critique of academies which makes them right-wing unless Alice is in a wonderland, where educational failure becomes left-wing, and investment and reform to combat it are somehow right-wing. Now, this is repeated, this kind of very acerbic, very in-your-face kind of analysis is included all the way through the book, and that certainly appealed to my slightly adversarial nature. It's a cracking read. I'm sure that at least one man in the audience does take issue with some of the abbreviations. PDQ, I thought that that would be on John Rentoul's banned list fairly soon, actually. But I now give you a man who has done great things and could well do great things in the future, to talk about his new book, Education, Education, Education. I give you Lord Adonis.
Thanks, John. That was very kind. John, thanks so much. It's really great to be here this evening. When I was Transport Secretary, they called me the Thin Controller. I'm now responsible for nothing other than my diary. In fact, actually, I've just gone back onto the front bench in the Lords to, which is the reason why I was nearly late today. I've gone on the front bench to shadow Paul Dayton, who, as you know, is about to become Infrastructure Minister. My other great passion, I have a huge passion for education, my other great passion is transport. Actually, I have a sort of passion for getting things to work, which is a sort of unusual passion in Britain, because we just sort of complacently and fatalistically accept that large parts of our national infrastructure don't work, and I include schools in that historically. And I sort of have this slightly quaint idea that perhaps we could make them work, and they could be efficient, and we could be a mainstream European nation in all those sorts of ways. But alas, I don't control the timetable of the Lords, and that's why I was slightly late, because I couldn't get away soon enough. But I do relish the irony of the fact that Paul Dayton, who's becoming the Minister for Infrastructure, starts his job in January. So I must be unique in at least one respect, which is being a shadow minister who's appointed 3 months before the real minister. The shadow, as I put it this afternoon, materialising before the substance, which sort of sums up a large part of the government's problems with infrastructure at the moment. But it is great to be here this evening. Because I'm no longer responsible for anything except my diary, I can also speak more frankly. Part of the trick in government, and I see I've got one of my former private secretaries, Sam, who's sitting right in the middle looking at me. His job is to keep, tabs on me, so I didn't depart from the straight and narrow and all that. When you're doing radical things, is how you do them and get on with the business, whilst, as I'll say a bit more in a moment, about building the maximum possible consensus. And the way I've always done it, which I think is actually by and large, everyone has their own style. Some people are extremely pugilistic. The last time I was in this hall, it was Dennis Healy, who was being interviewed by, was it Peter Jay? No, it was That's right, Bill Keegan, wasn't it? Bill Keegan. Now, if you want the archetype of the moderate pugilist, I mean, somebody who was actually seeking to govern and lead from the centre, but who did it by attacking everyone in sight, including most people on his own side. That's Dennis Healy for you. And actually, you'll see that in the book I draw a, which hasn't been picked up to my surprise, but...
I tweeted it over the weekend.
Oh, did you? Dennis Healy and Ed Balls. There's a bit of a... Actually, Ed Balls was here for the Dennis Healy... for the Dennis Healy session, which was slightly disappointing because Dennis wasn't on his most pugilistic form. He was sort of unusually, indeed almost incredibly, he was agreeing with people, which he never did in his heyday. He'd disagree with everybody on principle. But my style has always been the exact opposite as a minister, which has been to... I very, very rarely attack people. My way of dealing with people I disagree with is to ignore them. That's by far the most effective way of doing it. It's particularly important if the people you're disagreeing with are in your own party, which in my case, that was true a lot of it because of the sorts of reforms I was carrying through. So create the maximum possible degree of rhetorical consensus, even when you're including in that rhetorical consensus people who basically don't agree with you, but you co-opt them into agreeing with you, and there are all kinds of ways of doing it, usually by saying we all agree about the ends, even if we don't agree about the means. Sometimes I'm not even sure that there was agreement about the ends, but nonetheless you say that, and then studiously ignore your opponents. Now I'm a bit more frank about it in the book, because I'm trying to write as honest a history as I can. But the last chapter of the book, which is what I want to talk about this evening, because I'm assuming that most of you are interested in politics as much as education. Most of the audiences I've done on the book have been educationalists wanting to talk about education policy. I can bore for Britain on the A-back, the tech-back, my views on the reform of further education colleges, the precise types of free schools I approve of, those I don't, and all of that. And if you want to ask me questions about that at the end, by all means do. But I thought what I would address this evening is something which actually, because I started off as teaching politics at Oxford. Politics and the study of politics has always been my great love, like John's, both John's and so many of you here today. And in the last chapter of the book, called How to Be a Reformer, I've tried to extract from my experience over the last 10 years some lessons for, on how to bring about reform. And actually, I'll expand on them a bit more now, not just to include education, but also to include my period, which I actually enjoyed far more than education, as Secretary of State for Transport at the end. I'm basically a train buff. You know, I've always wanted to be a train driver since about the age of 4. I've regarded education as duty, I mean, a real powerful sense of duty, which is the reason why I stuck with it for so long. I mean, we have got to get in this country a first-rate education system, but my great love is transport. And, you know, when I was age 7, I was busy trying to improve on British Rail's rail timetables. I always regarded them as far too slow, the trains, and I was accelerating them all in timetables I was doing. My first great political campaign, the reason I'm in politics in a curious way, was fighting to keep open a railway line, the line between Oxford and Worcester, which British Rail was trying to close, and they falsified all the figures. I mean, these big bureaucracies always do. And I got my friends, this is when I was 15, I got my friends walking up and down the train counting the number of passengers so I could prove that British Rail's figures were wrong. I then wrote a whole set of letters to my local MP, who was a guy called Neil Martin, who was the predecessor but 3 to David Cameron as MP for Witney. And he took up the issue, and I also deluged the then chairman of British Rail with letters proving that their figures were wrong. And that kept, crucially, it kept some of the trains on the line, so they weren't able to close the line, and now it's actually one of the most successful railway lines in the country. However, I did learn a lesson from that too. I thought that was due to the work of the Cotswold Line Promotion Group and people like me going up and down the trains counting the number of passengers. In fact, it was because Sir Peter Parker lived near Charlbury. He lived at a place called Minster Lovell, and he was desperate to keep the line open, obviously, because he used it all the time. He couldn't be so self-interested as himself to seek to reverse the decision of his own board. But once this pressure group came in, he was more than keen to keep it open. So politics is my great love. And when I was writing the book, I thought a particular reason for doing it is that one of the most influential books of people who are ministers is Gerald Kaufman's very, very witty book, How to Be a Minister. Now, my profound conviction is that being a minister is very easy. I mean, basically, people like Sam and others, they put you in a cocoon, and unless you are totally incompetent, there are some who are so incompetent they can't even literally read out the words which are given to them on the page and cut the ribbon and get up in the morning and turn up work in time and not get involved in scandals. There are some who can't even do the sort of the minimum requirements of remaining a minister. But that, to my mind, isn't the real challenge. Being a minister in our system isn't difficult. Being a reformer is very difficult. And what I tried to do instead was to abstract from my experience, the lessons on how to bring about reform. And that's what I want to talk about now, if I may, for just a few minutes. But as I said, I'd be very happy to take questions about more detailed issues in education policy afterwards. And I abstracted 12 lessons, and I'll go through them one by one and say a few words about each, and perhaps that will stimulate some questions afterwards. The first requirement in being a reformer is, as I put it, to address the big problems. My great role model for the successful reforming minister was Roy Jenkins, who's in many ways my political hero. But I offer three, actually, in the book. Roy Jenkins, an unlikely trio, given that they're politically so different. Roy Jenkins, Michael Heseltine, and Ken Livingstone. What they all have in common is that they sought to address the very big reform challenges that faced them in their areas. They were not constrained by established party positions or the problems of trying to break through an existing consensus. And they were all three of them extremely bold in how they tackled the big problems that they faced. What Roy Jenkins wanted to do was basically dramatically liberalise the social state. He basically wanted to bring Britain into a more modern, socially liberal position. He'd spent the 50s, I mean, Roy Jenkins was the guy who produced private members' bills in the late 1950s to reform the law on obscene publications. He was promoted legislation on the Lady Chatterley case. He gave evidence in the Lady Chatterley case. We've got to remember quite how stiflingly repressive the British state still was in terms of social matters in the late 50s, 60s. He developed a whole plan, which he then wrote up in a blueprint for reforming all of England's social laws. And the first instance of boldness, which I completely understand from my own experience, was that he knew that he only really wanted to do one job in government. He wanted to be Home Secretary, because he had a whole plan for liberalising the British state and ensuring that social freedoms were more widely respected. So therefore, when he was offered his very first job was Minister for Aviation, so he was outside the cabinet. But when he was offered by Wilson his first cabinet job, which almost everybody, I do not know anyone in my whole experience of government over 12 years who's turned down the first offer of a cabinet post. Roy Jenkins did. He turned down the offer, ironically, the offer to become Education Secretary in 1965. Now, the reason he turned it down is he didn't have a policy. He said, he told me when I was, because I got to know him well at the end of his life, he had no idea what his education policy would be. And the education policy, which was the established policy of his party, which was comprehensivization, he was deeply worried about. He thought it was probably mistaken. He certainly couldn't get enthusiastic about it. It meant, as he put it to me, abolishing my old school, which I don't think is a good idea. But of course, he couldn't say any of that publicly, because that's what the government was committed to. So what he said to Harold Wilson, this is a wonderful exchange, he said to Harold Wilson, Howard, I can't possibly be Education Secretary. All three of my children go to private schools. To which Wilson replied as quick as a flash, don't worry, Roy, so do all mine. Which sort of describes to you, actually, in some ways, the problem of education policy in the 1960s and afterwards. However, 6 months later, and he says to Wilson, the job I would like, though I can't see it coming up anytime soon, and you may not think I'm suitable for it, the job I would like is to be Home Secretary. Sir Frank Soskis moves in the next reshuffle. Roy does get the job. I mean, to continue the exchange, Wilson is astonished. He says that no one has ever asked him for the job of Home Secretary. You know, it's been traditionally regarded as a graveyard slot in government. But I do sympathise with that, because I've only ever done jobs in government that I really wanted to, and I've always turned down jobs that where I don't think it was possible to make a big impact. The offer to become Prisons Minister I did not find attractive, because I do actually have an agenda for reform of prisons, but it wasn't one that was likely to work at any time I was likely to be able to implement it. But I did tell Gordon Brown I wanted to go to transport, and there was this silence when I said it. He said, no one has ever asked me to go to transport, he said. But because I did have a reform plan worked out, it's a pretty good idea in my experience to put people in jobs that they want to do and they have a plan for. Obviously, it has to be one that the government as a whole supports and the Prime Minister supports. That needs to be. Now, that's what Roy did. Roy was only Home Secretary. It's an astonishing fact when you think about the 60s and how dominant he was over the politics and the reform of 1960. He was only Home Secretary for 21 months. 21 months. In that 21 months, he did the following. He legalised abortion. I mean, through private members, by all means, kinds of indirect routes, but without him it wouldn't have happened. He legalised abortion. He legalised homosexuality. He abolished flogging in prisons. He set in train the introduction of no-fault divorce, which was then implemented by the Home Secretary after him. He more than halved the number of police authorities and modernised the whole operation of the police. All of that in the space of less than 2 years. More legislative success and more social transformation, what about in that very short period of time, than any other minister who's held the office of Home Secretary in, I think, probably in the last 150 years. I mean, Robert Peel did a reasonably good job creating the Metropolitan Police, but that was one reform, and I think he was Home Secretary for longer. So an extraordinary set of reforms, most of which, of course, were in defiance of majority opinion even in his own party. Wilson disagreed with him on all these reforms. In all of the divisions, all of them, on the Abortion Act and the Abortion Bill and the bill legalising homosexuality, Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, does not vote in one single division. He never turns up in the House of Commons while this is going through, while his Home Secretary is pioneering all this great and radical reform. So addressing the big issues is a crucial thing. Hezza addressed the big issues when it came to development and infrastructure planning. He's very much my model as an infrastructure planner. High Speed 1 was Hezza. Docklands, of course, Hezza. The Jubilee line, Hezza. And he would have done a great deal more. He was a great champion, which I'm a strong supporter of city mayors. We have got to give strong leadership to our cities outside London in the same way as they have in London. If we're ever going to get serious decentralisation, and it's a huge pity that the referendums didn't succeed last year, but I don't think this issue will be resolved until we can get strong, really accountable and well-known leaders of our cities. I mean, just as a point of, can anyone here name the leaders of Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham city councils? The second, third and fourth largest cities in the country? Anyone? Any offers? We've got one. Anyone? Any others? Well, Albert Bohr in Birmingham, Leeds. Any takers for Leeds? Well, I'll move rapidly on, but there's a very, very big reform agenda there too. And Ken Livingstone, the congestion charge would not have happened without Ken. He was way ahead of his time on minority rights. I mean, he was way ahead of me on this, but clearly right. And the transformation of London Transport more widely, all the tube upgrades, Crossrail, the transformation of the bus network wouldn't have happened without him too. So, but what all three of them have in common is worked it out before what they wanted to do, real plan, political courage, willingness to have a big argument on their own side, and capacity to get things through. Now, when I went to work for Tony Blair as his education advisor in 1998, it was clear to me that the single dominating issue in education policy, which you couldn't duck if you were going to be a reformer, doing your level best to tackle the big issues, was the reform of the comprehensive school. Comprehensives over most of the country were either poorly performing or very poorly performing. I mean, just to give you one statistic to illustrate what the situation was in 1997. In 1997, a majority of comprehensives in England, a majority were only getting 5 decent GCSE passes, including English and maths, which is a basic baccalaureate standard that we all expect in this hall for our children, but only getting that for less than 30% of their pupils. So in the majority of comprehensive schools, the great majority of students were not getting indeed, in most cases, even close to a basic baccalaureate standard. Now, what I said internally, because to be a reformer, you need to call a spade internally, you'd be very careful how you pitch it externally. These were basically schools that were failing. Now, there was a big debate about what was the right reform agenda and all that, but what was striking on my own side and on the Tory side was that this had been regarded as territory far too toxic to touch. We came in 1997 with good policies for which there was a broad consensus for improving literacy and numeracy in primary schools. David Blunkett had a great slogan, a child who cannot read, cannot learn. That was absolutely right. Michael Barber was put in there, big machinery of government change, the standards and effectiveness unit in the department doing all of that. But we had no policy worth the name for reforming the secondary school. And it was clear to me from looking at it, again, I don't get into details, so I want to move on to the other points too, that basically, it's not rocket science. To have a good secondary school, you need 2 things above all. You need a management structure that works, that gives real accountability, leadership, power to the people who are managing the outfit. And you need good teachers. And the academy policy Teach First, all of those big policies that we pioneered in government and which I played a part in forging, were relentlessly focused on those two big objectives, to get fit-for-purpose governance for secondary schools, which meant not only putting good heads in, but also having good governing structures. The problem with these underperforming comprehensives is that their governing bodies were chronically weak as well, partly because they were so largely dependent on local bureaucracies, and local bureaucracies, indeed national bureaucracies, are not good at running institutions. So you needed high-capacity governance, which is where sponsors came in, which came from organisations, including successful schools, successful private schools, universities, a whole range of organisations that had very good and high-quality governance, taking over the governance of schools that were systematically underperforming. And of course, once you get the governance right, then you get the wider leadership right too. It was an immensely controversial reform because it meant taking the governance function in respect to those schools away from the local authority. In my view, it was it wasn't a particularly difficult reform. It wasn't, I mean, people talked about privatisation. It wasn't the privatisation of education at all. All these organisations were not-for-profit. Most of them were actually in the public sector. A high proportion of them were existing schools and their governing bodies, very successful existing state schools and their governing bodies, which were more than capable of governing more than one institution. Private schools, which of course in this country are charities, and all of them have charitable duties, and universities. That was the first part of the reform. The second part of the reform was to dramatically improve the number and quality of those applying into teaching. And you have to think back again to 1997. In 1997, we talked about shortage subjects, meaning subjects for teaching in secondary school, including maths, most of the sciences, IT, modern languages, and in some parts of the country, even English, where there were not enough applicants to fill the teacher training posts. We're not talking about quality or choice. And of course, the numbers, as I found out one of the first meetings I did as a minister, was that the numbers were massaged down because the application levels were so low. So you had a double crisis. You weren't recruiting enough teachers into the system, partly because you didn't dare set targets at the level which you actually needed to recruit at, because you knew you couldn't hit them. And hence, big changes to teacher recruitment and training, the introduction of Teach First, which has been a huge success. 1,000. Any of those of you coming up to graduation have got a passion for working with children and teaching and all that, do think of Teach First. It's absolutely transformational, and I understand that Michael Gove is saying nice things about me. Well, I met him yesterday to discuss the introduction of a new charity to apply the Teach First model to children's social work, which is another great crisis profession in our country that is causing untold social damage at the moment because we don't have enough good graduates and young people going into it. And a whole set of reforms there were put in place. Now, I made lots of mistakes. We didn't get everything right. If I had my time again, I would do a lot of things differently. But those two big sets of reforms, to teacher recruitment and training on the one hand, and to transforming the governance and leadership of comprehensive schools on the other, were all geared to producing effective, successful comprehensive schools, we call them academies, in place of ineffective, unsuccessful comprehensive schools, which about half, you can debate it, being a higher proportion of our teenagers were attending in the late 1990s. Now, that's my first lesson on how to be a reformer. You must go for the big problems. It's quite easy to engage in displacement activity. Tim Brighouse, who is an extraordinary education guru, he told me early on, always, he said, avoid time and energy traps. He said, in his experience, leaders, this extends well beyond ministers, leaders of all kinds, spend colossal amounts of time on things that don't ultimately matter. Now, the problem if you're a minister is that you are absolutely forced to spend at least half your time on things that don't matter anyway. It just goes with the job. You know, if I had to calculate the number of hours I had to spend sitting on the front bench in the House of Lords, answering, you know, debates, questions, I mean, this is important business. It's being publicly accountable and all of that. But what was that? I mean, I'm not denigrating this in any way. It's very, very important. And all of those huge pieces of legislation that I carried through, they were very, very worthwhile pieces of legislation too. And I'm sure all of those clauses, which I ended in abstruse debates on at 2 o'clock in the morning, it was all very, very worthwhile. But it doesn't actually, most of it, constitute real reform and real change. And you're forced to do a lot of that. And there's a huge amount of crisis management as a minister. There's hardly a week that went by without having to deal with some crisis or other. Most of them become forgotten afterwards, but a hugely important time. We had exam marking crises. Do you remember Cash for Honours? Well, that started with academies. That had me occupied with my learned friends for, you know, I mean, all of these things. I was constantly in the courts on academies as judicially reviewed to death by the NUT. I mean, a whole load of stuff that happens anyway that, that you can't control, that can overwhelm the diary for days, sometimes weeks on end, unless you've got a very, very clear sense of the very big priorities that you're seeking to address. You have a clearly worked out plan, preferably before you become a minister. I didn't have it completely worked out before. I went to work for Tony Blair, so I wasn't absolutely in the Jenkins mould in that sense. But unless you've done all that, you won't succeed. And the starting point is to focus on the big problems. The second essential in being a reformer is, as I put it, to seek the truth and fail to succeed. In my experience, failure is often very important for building consensus and indeed persuading yourself about the case for radical change. In the case both of academies and of Teach First, which were the two most radical policies I was responsible for driving through, neither of those would have happened if lesser reforms hadn't failed first. We tried to introduce reforms that improved the governance of failing comprehensives within the local authority system. It didn't work. It was led to marginal improvements, but with regression afterwards. I tried to introduce a state-led scheme, so not an external scheme, for attracting far more high flyers into teaching, and again, it didn't work. It was suffocated by the bureaucracy. It became very bureaucratized. It didn't have the branding and image and esprit de corps and huge dynamic force that Teach First had. So it is a process of trial and error to some extent, but if you are addressing the big questions, then what you do, of course, is to come at it again and again, which is important. Seeking the truth, I'm surprised how many politicians don't actually show much interest in the facts, or rather the facts are kind of reverse engineered to meet the policies that they've already determined. Andreas Schleicher, who is the education director of the OECD, has a great phrase that I use all the time now. Without facts, you are simply another person with an opinion. And accumulating facts and seeking honestly to address in a factual and analytical way the problem that you face is very important. So the way I used to deal all the time with building consensus is very, very difficult in politics, particularly when you're dealing with semi or wholly ideological matters, which is very true of education. And one of the tricks I learned on this early on is to have conversations that as much as possible factually based and as little as possible ideologically based, or at least the bit that's ideological is in areas that you agree with. So the way it was incredibly difficult at the beginning to get local authorities and MPs, this wasn't actually just a matter of Labour MPs, it was MPs of all parties who were very conservative-minded to agree to academies because they were usually controversial locally. And the way I worked out how to do it wasn't to have a big argument about independent state schools or how I believe this could improve it or any of that. What I would do, and Sam can bear witness to this because he was having to organise so many of these trips, is on Fridays or other days if I could do it, was to get out to the office and go and visit these schools. Most of the schools that were placed by academies I visited myself. I mean, I visited hundreds of them over the course of the time I was a minister and advisor before. And what I would always do would be to take the leader of the council, the director of education, and the MP, as many of those as I could get hold of, and usually if you're a minister, they will turn up with you, around the school, around the... I say, look, before we discuss what we're going to do with it, let's all go and see it. One very striking thing, in most of these cases, the director of education and the leader of the council had never been around these schools themselves, which was quite telling about part of the problem you had about local authority management of schools. What would usually happen, if I sort of, simplify, is that we would go around the school. It was usually, the situation was pretty grim. I mean, the buildings were often terrible and all that, but there was no gainsaying the fact that the teaching and learning wasn't good, that there was quite a lot of disaffection around. I mean, often it was blatantly obvious as you went around, but often it wasn't hard to detect. And we would go through the facts, the exam stats, absentee stats, get the feel of the school. An Ofsted inspector told me that you can tell a good school within 10 minutes of arriving by three things. Firstly, meeting the head teacher. The second and the third are more unusual. The second is the displays on the wall, whether there are any to start with and whether they're any good, a very good telltale sign of how good a school is. The third one, he said to me, was the state of the boys' toilets. Now, when I was minister, I didn't think it was a good idea to be going around the boys' toilets, but those are three quite uncanny things. But if you look at if you go around a school, of course, you get a very good sense of it, if you then analyse the data offers. And what I tended to find, coming back to Andreas Schleicher's point about facts, is if you did that, and by the way, this is quite an unusual way for ministers to behave. Not many ministers get out systematically. What they tend to do, which is a complete time and energy trap, is they turn up and they make speeches, which are written for them by civil servants, at conferences which they're told by those civil servants are important, because they are engaging with stakeholders, which is always thought to be an important thing, which is usually just other people who go around to conferences to listen to ministers making speeches. And you, by and large, by the way, most of these speeches have nothing to say. Ministers only make serious policy announcements a few times a year. Those are the times I would make speeches. A golden rule of mine was never to make a speech which, to a conference in an audience of this kind, unless I had something to say. All of that time was much better spent going around schools, engaging with real situations where real reforms were needed. And having had those meetings, the conversation you then had with the leader of the council and the MP was completely different. It was basically about, look, we've all seen this together. This is the situation. Are we going to let this continue? Or I have somebody who's run a brilliant school, which I can take you to too, or you can go see yourself. Would you prefer that to be what happens here? Now, of course, I wasn't totally powerless in this. I was also carried the government's checkbook. Money is a really crucial driver of reform, much more important than legislation in my experience. I kept clear of legislation like the plague in the areas that I was seeking to reform. It's a big mistake that ministers make because they're mostly parliamentarians. I think it's legislation that drives reform. In my experience, it's charisma, it's real passion, it's good analytics, so you've actually got a reform thing that is going to work, and it's money. All of those things are what drive reform. But ministerial time is therefore at a premium. So the second requirement is to seek the truth and fail to succeed. And seeking the truth also means working with others to try and reach an agreement on what the truth is. Third, keep it simple. In my experience, almost all solutions to big problems are simple. Complexity comes from qualifying the simple solution because the simple solution is unpalatable, which usually means politically unpalatable. It might be bureaucratically unpalatable as well. Now, academies, the idea, but this was absolutely crucial, was brilliantly simple, which is that you give the governance function of the school, the governance function, which is the function on which all else turns in terms of the management of the school. You give the governance function to a high-capacity governing agent, which might be a trust, it might be another school, it might be an individual business philanthropist, whatever, it might be a university, a number of academy sponsors universities, you give that governance function to them, and then you give them all the powers within a contract from the state, which govern certain key requirements, all the powers necessary to govern that institution. Now, the simplicity was also the radicalism, because this meant taking the governance of those schools away from local authority bureaucracies, which was very radical. All the time when I was developing and implementing this policy, all of my best friends, all of the people who were busy telling me that this could be made much more palatable and saleable, were all telling me I could do that if I qualified the simplicity. If you had a continuing governance relationship with the local authority, or the local authority itself became part of the governing function as well, all of whatever it was, qualifying the simplicity, then it would be politically more palatable. But in fact, actually, that would have completely undermined the reform too. It was the same with Teach First. The crucial thing about Teach First is it was being run by an independent charity separate from the government. It was not being run by the public bureaucracy, and it therefore was able to get on with its branding, recruitment, and all of that in a completely independent way. Again, I had the teacher training agency and the department wanting this to be a joint venture because they were worried about losing control and all that, qualifying the simplicity. Keeping it simple is very important. Fourthly, be bold, but go with the grain as far as possible. This is a very important point if you're a reformer in a country called England. England is a country with a very long tradition, which is most of our problems go back to Henry VIII or longer, if you want to chart them. There's a very deep fatalism about tackling problems, largely because they are so historic. But also, there's this great belief that that the way things have been done in the past is the way they should be done. People don't put it like that. They don't express themselves in very conservative terms, but that is their natural reflex. And one of the things I discovered in education, it's also true in transport too. When I was Transport Secretary, there was me trying to produce a really modern transport infrastructure, including high-speed trains that will actually link our major cities in the way that they do in almost every other developed country in the world now. Not a desperately radical notion. The first high-speed train started in Japan in 1964 in the run-up to the Tokyo Olympics. The Japanese are now on their 7th iteration of their high-speed trains. The French opened their first line in 1981. The Italians opened their first line in 1978. The Germans were a few years later. Even the Americans, who sort of hated public transport, has been a huge problem. They're now building their line between California and LA. All of this is happening here. But the number of representations I got when I became Transport Secretary about the case for high-speed rail was 0. Once we got going on analysing the case for it, making the argument, the big northern cities all came on board quite quickly, and they are now passionate about it. But even then, for every one representation I got about high-speed rail and fundamental modernisation of our rail infrastructure, you know, the West Coast Main Line, the Victorians built it in the 1830s, and we're still seeking to modernise it rather than building a new high-capacity modern line up there. For every one representation I would get about high-speed rail, I would get, what, let me try and quantify it, 200, 300, about opening some branch line, which Lord Beeching closed in 1963 or 1964. Now, as it happens, Lord Beeching did go too far. Let me say, because if this is being live streamed, this will cause more deluge of letters and tweets. I mean, Twitter will be going mad at the fact that some of the Beeching cuts might have been worthwhile. I mean, you know, this is a sin against the Holy Ghost with my railway our friends. Some of them were wrong. It was, for example, mad to close the line between Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, a number of east-west and trunk routes which Beeching closed, we're now bitterly regretting they were closed and they need to be open. However, the line from Fairford to Oxford and another 200 I could mention, going from essentially one village to another set of villages to a town, which probably, you know, 15 or 20 people were using a day and was involving massive subsidies equivalent to providing free cars for the individual use of each passenger. This was clearly not a sustainable position at all. But that is still very much in the English psyche, and my good friend Michael Portillo has made a whole career out of going around with Bradshaw, you know, looking at the... I mean, I now know what I can do when I really am in need of further employment and being a transport buff. But the point about it is that we're a country very much governed by our past. I'm a proud Brit, and there's a good side to it. Part of the reason we're so governed by our past is we do have a continuous past. It hasn't been too bad a one either, actually, as a country. You know, there aren't many countries that come out of the 20th century which win, in terms of the record of good governance, democracy and all of that, can hold their head as proud as we can. That's part of the reason why we don't feel this need constantly to start again and all that. However, there is a very important point that comes out of it, which is important to the reformer, which is particularly when you're engaging in bold reforms, you need the actual arguments you make and the reforms themselves to be as conservative as possible. The Academy's policy I very carefully modelled on church schools within the state system, and I always cited them as precedents. The agreement which R.A. Butler made with the churches which allowed essentially independently governed schools within the state system. I argued that, and indeed the argument I was used to use, which nonplussed my friends on the left, many of them of course aren't desperately religious and don't think the Church of England is the paragon of virtue, was, are you really saying that the only people who can run independent schools in the state system are religious organisations and the churches? You know, are you not prepared to give the same right to universities, successful schools, successful education trusts and organisations of that kind? That slightly nonplussed them. But the model that was set up was very carefully modelled on, I mean, for those of you who are techie, there's a number of different sorts of church schools, and the type of school called voluntary aided, which is a type of legal category. Academies were quite closely modelled on voluntary aided schools, except that the contract wasn't with the local authority, it was with central government, but very closely modelled. And indeed, even the reason, which I think was a mistake, the reason why at the beginning of the Academy policy I insisted on there being a financial contribution was that precisely mirrored the regime with church schools, which made a financial contribution, it was then 15% of capital costs, in return for having this degree of autonomy. And when I make the arguments for high-speed rail, I mean, when I make the arguments for most of the things I do in transport, I make very conservative arguments based on what happens that works well here. So high-speed 2, look at high-speed 1, it is possible. People say it's not possible to build railways in straight lines in this country. By the way, that's what people thought about roads for a long time. Sir Leslie Hoare-Belisha, when he was transport minister, you'll remember him because of a certain light with a yellow covering around it. That was the sort of apogee of transport modernisation in the 1930s and 40s. He was against motorways on the grounds that they were un-English and fascist because they were straight. You know, this is in the 1930s. This is what we were dealing with. The War Cabinet developed the first plan for motorways in 1942. And it wasn't until we got Ernest Marples, who was the only person who's held the office of Transport Minister, the only person since the war who has held the office for 5 continuous years. Most of us held it for a year or 18 months, who actually did it. But again, I use very conservative arguments. My argument for when I was seeking to electrify the Great Western Main Line from Swansea to London. Electrification was deeply controversial in my department. They all argued when I became Transport Minister that this was a great waste of money, that the Treasury said that the returns weren't there, that it was much more cost-effective to build new diesel locomotives. Was Wales is the only country in Europe, apart from Albania, that does not have a single mile of electrified railway. It can't be the case that everyone else has got it wrong, except Albania. In Europe. On high-speed rail, I would go through the chapter and verse on what every other country was doing, but also the very conservative argument, which is what I think carried my colleagues, which is that you basically have two choices. But it's very important, you know, it takes a lot of work to get these arguments honed, that if, in terms of the major conurbations of the country, which of course are Greater London, the West Midlands and the North West, where we're going to need very significant additional transport capacity over the next generation, you've basically got two choices. You either build a new line or you do successive upgrades of the West Coast Main Line. The last upgrade of the West Coast Main Line cost £10 billion. £10 billion, because you're doing open heart surgery on a Victorian railway. So what is the best prognosis, if you do the numbers, but it needs to be done analytically, it was a huge job of work to do, is that over the next generation you either build a new line or you probably have to do 3 or 4 upgrades of the West Coast Main Line that would end up, when you do the maths, costing more. Now it's the typical British genius to end up spending more in order to get a slightly souped-up version of the Victorian Railway, rather than to go for the bold reform which is now common international practice, and which has huge other benefits in terms of speed, connectivity, bringing the cities closer together in a country which is blessed by having an economic geography where, in fact, our major conurbations are quite close together, but we don't make nearly enough benefit from it because it takes so long to get between them and so on. So my fourth principle of how to be a reformer is be bold, but go with the grain as far as possible and cast your arguments in as conservative a language as possible. Fifthly, lead and explain, lead and explain. Until I became a minister, I hadn't realised how important this was, because I was a policy wonk before, sitting in the number 10 policy unit, and I regarded then, which is right, the optimal level of publicity and profile as being 0. I was always clear as an advisor, and all my experience looking at some of my colleagues as advisors and advisors now, is that if you are an advisor, particularly if you're on number 10, where you've got all of the journalists, you know, circling around you like sharks, you should want no publicity whatsoever. If you show any desire to get any, you will become very rapidly in the news the whole time. However, when you're a minister, the opposite is true. If you're a reformer, what you want to do is to get the highest possible profile you can for your reforms, and indeed you've got to do so, because your only chance of carrying them is that you're constantly leading and explaining. I have to be frank, I regarded this as the toughest part of the job. I hadn't done much broadcasting when I became minister. I was parachuted into the House of Lords. I had been a local councillor when I was in my 20s, but since then I hadn't done high-profile politics. I'd been a journalist, but I'd been a print journalist. And of course, you know, in those days, I mean, I know that John Rentoul is now a household name, and you can't get him off the box. But in those days, we didn't really sort of do much, you know, in front of house stuff. And I was literally physically sick at the prospect of Humphreys and Paxman. And that alone was nearly enough to get me to turn down becoming a minister, just the thought of it. But you've absolutely got to do it. And if you don't, then you create a void. And it's a very, very important set of skills. And also, you have to develop a thick skin, which it took me some time to develop. More Andrew than Adonis, that was the kinder end of the comments. I mean, I could run through the others, because of course they're all seared on my mind. You pretend that they're not, but they are. The worst offence ever against the Trade Descriptions Act. I mean, it goes on and on. You just have to you develop a bit of a thick skin for these things. Sixthly, build a team. Building a team is absolutely crucial, and it's particularly difficult to do as a minister because of the way that our civil service runs. You have to build a team. You cannot accomplish anything big unless you have a lot of true believers, a real esprit de corps in the team that's around you, which must include, because that's the only team you've got, a large group of civil servants. But you play almost no part in choosing them. And that is an unusually difficult job. Most people who have leadership positions have at least some say, usually all the say, in choosing the people who are around them. Well, you are allowed to express a preference for who your private secretary is, though in my experience you don't always even, I mean in Sam's case I did get the one I wanted, but you don't always even get the private secretary that you want. But you play very little part in in choosing the other civil service. Now, I don't want to get into a big argument about the nature of our civil service. As it happens, I think the arguments are quite finely balanced. They're quite finely balanced. They're a great virtue of our system, and it is an enormous virtue, as I've seen countries in our, seen governments in other countries, is that we have a wholly, indeed, or almost wholly, non-corrupt public service. The examples of corruption I came across in my 12 years in government were trifling. No, I didn't come across a single serious case of corruption. That's very unusual in governments internationally. You know, when I was in Beijing 3 years ago as Transport Minister, looking at their high-speed line, which was just about to open between Shanghai and Beijing, the then Transport Minister I met, he's in jail now on corruption charges. His chief official, he's in jail on corruption charges. I think one of my officials pointed out to me that everybody I met on that trip has now either been sacked or is in jail on corruption charges. And that all happened because, you remember there was a big crash on the Chinese high-speed rail line, which was supposed to have been caused by 2 strikes of lightning on 2 trains in different locations, which then caused them to crash. It had nothing much to do with lightning, it had everything to do with the line not being properly specced and lots of money going in different directions. We don't have that problem, which is one of the biggest arguments, I think, for our current civil service. The problem with it is it's what I call the 80% civil service. It only ever 80% believes in what the government of the day wants, because it regards its job as to be independent, which it interprets, in the case of most officials, as being only believing in what the government is doing up to a point. Very, very few officials, and it's a temperamental thing about being an independent civil servant. Very, very few officials see their job as in a really serious way to engage and come behind and deliver for the government of the day, including giving frank advice. I mean, it was very unusual to get completely frank advice too. A quiet life was too often what was wanted. So I see the arguments as finely balanced between having an American system where the elected government of the day, remember this is a democracy, the elected government of the day can determine the senior posts of the public service, and it appoints people who actually agree with what it's wanting to do. I mean, you obviously want them, you probably have some process of ratification, see that they pass bona fides, that they're good and people without tainted records and all of that, but nonetheless they're people who do believe what the government's seeking to do, as opposed to simply career civil servants. You can make, there are arguments both ways of this. However, the reality is, if you're a minister in the British system, you come in with almost no control over the people who work for you. At least over time you can start to affect it, but only within certain parameters. But you've got to build a team. And that is a very, very tough job. And contrary to the current government, though in my book I'm very critical of the civil service, and I think there are big reforms that need to be made and all of that, the worst possible way to do it, the worst possible way, is to criticise the civil servants who work for you while you're doing these jobs. You absolutely must love them to bits. It doesn't matter how incompetent they are. It doesn't matter what the problems you've got getting things done. It doesn't matter how big the rows are behind closed doors. You love them to bits publicly, you are 100% loyal to them, you take responsibility for everything that happens, you do not hide behind civil servants, you absolutely do not start describing them as enemies of enterprise or language of this kind, because these are the people who your only hope of being able to do anything is that when they get up in the morning, they actually think that by and large it's a good idea to process that academy application, to go and hold that meeting with the local authority, to go up to Birmingham and start negotiating about Birmingham Moor Street Station and Curzon Street and how it could become the terminus of the high-speed station. If they don't do it, no one else is going to do it for you. You've got to get these people working for you. You've got to motivate them. And I found a lot of the motivational job was internal. I said, you've got to do the Paxman and all of that. I spent a lot of time seeking to motivate, as best I could, the officials who worked for me into really believing what the government was doing. Because my view was that if they simply regarded it as a job, it's true of everything. If you simply regard it as a job, you might give 40 or 50% to it. If you can get them actually to believe that it's just unacceptable that so many children are getting a second-rate education and that we have a big and passionate moral purpose to do something about it, which is what I always sought to do, then you can hopefully get them to the 80%. And actually, I got some brilliant people who were at the 100% who were there. You've got to build a team in very difficult circumstances where we can't actually determine who's in the team. Seventhly, build coalitions, not tabernacles. It's nice being in groups of true believers, though in my experience, I was in a party called the SDP once. We were all supposed to be true believers. We all fell out bitterly and hated each other. Even in tabernacles, people tend to fall out. I learned a big experience from that, which is that you want to be in big parties, not in small parties, because though in big parties there's more brokering that needs to be done, there's more coalitions that need to be built and all that, that is your best chance of being able to bring about serious social and political change. The smaller the party, and we don't have PR, so you can't even hopefully, you hope to get in by the back door by being a very small party. I won't go into the Lib Dems at the moment. But the smaller the party, the less chance you've got to do that. And that means quite a lot of horse trading in the way that big coalitions do in terms of priorities and policies and all that. Eighthly, champion consumers, not producers. This is an incredibly important point. My rule of thumb when I was Transport Minister and Education Minister, I think every minister should have it, is always to put yourself in the position of the punter. My golden rule as Education Minister is I would never agree to anything except under duress, when sometimes there was no choice, if I wasn't prepared to apply it to my own children, and I would never say that a school was satisfactory if I wasn't prepared to send my own children to it. I didn't have a car when I was Secretary of State for Transport. I travelled on the tube every day, but not because I was being particularly heroic, but I just thought that the person who's responsible for the public transport system ought to use it. You know, unless you go through the same experience as the public goes, how can you expect them to trust you with the future of the public transport system? This was a very controversial idea amongst some of my colleagues. I tried to suggest to them that perhaps they should use the tube as well. But this is a very, very important principle. And actually it leads me, because I'm naturally a moderate, to some quite radical positions. I don't believe you should be Education Minister if your own children don't go to state schools. You don't have to be Education Minister. You don't even have to go into politics. If you are putting yourself in the position of the person who is responsible for the national education system, for other people's children, all of those other 7 million children besides your own who are expected to use the system, the very least you can do is to experience it yourself. I've got no compunction about people doing the best thing for their children. They want to go to private schools, but they shouldn't be an education minister if that's what they want to do. There are plenty of other jobs they can do which are separate from that. But building coalitions, not tabernacles, is very important. Ninthly, and this is against, I'm told, all the best management practice, but I've never really sort of learned how to be manager. I've just done it. On important issues, micromanage constantly. In my experience from reform, that's supposed to be very bad advice. You're supposed not to. You're supposed to be strategic. Well, strategy, in my experience, is largely waffle. I mean, you know, you do have to have a sense of where you're going, but the idea you spend all your time revisiting that and all that isn't where things are at all. In my experience, the crucial thing is to decide realistically what are the few things that really matter to you, on which your fate and the fate of all that you're seeking to accomplish turns, and those things that don't come into that category. On those things that really matter to you, you should micromanage constantly. And by that I mean you should be on top of it every day. There wasn't a single day when I was responsible for education policy that I didn't do something relating to academies. Not a single day. It was always on my mind. I'd often, when I was walking around on my mobile phone, make calls to people because things had suddenly occurred to me. I was making connections and all of that. You have got to be on top of it. However, when it came to the content of the A-level history syllabus, which I didn't, I mean, though actually, as it happens, I'm a historian, I didn't think was the single most pressing issue. I thought it was perfectly okay as it was. I didn't see it as big before. I was quite happy for the qualifications and curriculum agency to get on with that, and then if there's a problem, they can tell me and I deal with it. You can't physically, of course, micromanage everything. You have to decide what those few things are that you micromanage, and then you really have to be on top of those. 10thly, keep calm and carry on. And the worse the crises, the more important it is that you project calm, because everyone around you will be flapping like mad. And this is particularly true of politicians. One of the things about politicians is I'm passionately interested in you know, who's up, who's down, all of that. But when you're in charge of the national education system or the national transport system, I sort of felt that I had better things to do and should make it clear to other people they had better things to do than to be exchanging all the latest Westminster and Whitehall gossip. And so what I used to do was very ostentatiously to express no interest at all in that, as if I didn't read the newspapers and hadn't watched the news. What really matters is, you know, what we're going to do with reforming the school system in Manchester or Birmingham. And then, you know, when I got home, watch Newsnight and catch up on it and, you know, chat to my friends. But if the machine, which is the political machine as much as the bureaucratic machine, thinks that what you're really concerned about is the latest ups and downs of Blair, Brown, and whatever is the latest gossip about the permanent secretary, then that's what they want to talk about with you too, and that's not what you're there to do. And then 11thly, reform is a marathon, not a sprint. in my experience, all big reforms take some time to carry through. You can't expect them to be instantaneous. Our big problem in our system is we have very little continuity of ministers and senior civil servants. That is a really, really big problem. Academies was basically a 10-year project. If I had not been on manoeuvres in respect of academies at any point in the first 8 years, I think the policy would probably have stopped. And that may be massive self-aggrandizement. It's just my judgment, though, and it's a judgment that became even stronger as I look back at my diaries to piece together the story for the book. Carrying through big reforms is a very big undertaking. I mentioned the motorways. The only really big transformational piece of transport infrastructure that's been built since the war in this country is the motorways. It's no accident that Ernest Marple was Minister of Transport for 5 years. What would have happened if he hadn't? I suspect we wouldn't have had as many motorways. We would have had lots more that don't sort of join up. Quite a few of them don't join up at the moment. We just accept it that they won't, because that's the way it happens. And there is a big problem about leadership. And then, 12thly and lastly, always have a plan for the future. Part of the reason I wrote the book is that I've got massive ideas. I mean, lots that still needs to be done to reform the education system. I didn't want to write a conventional memoir. I think conventional memoirs are incredibly tedious because they're just about the past. What matters is what you're going to do in the future. Now, you need to learn from the past. I'm a historian. It's very important to learn from the past, but half of my book is about the past, half is about the future, including a whole set of proposals and what I see as the next big set of reforms in education. We have got to do dramatically more to get the brightest and best into teaching. I just finish you with this statistic, show you, where I'm coming from. In this country, today, we have on average two applicants per teacher training place. So teaching, even after all the improvements of the last 20 years, is still barely a selective profession. The best educated nations in the world, their teacher training systems have an average of 10 to 20 applicants per teacher training place. This is Andreas Schleicher, Get Your Reforms Driven by Data. We have got to produce big reforms, and I set that out in the book what they could be. Big reforms which make teaching a genuinely top profession in terms of the aspirations of the most successful graduates, which significantly increase the numbers who are applying, so that we can get far, far more of the brightest and best in our classrooms, and not just in the classrooms of the top private schools and state schools, which have never had a problem recruiting, but in the classrooms in schools within a mile of this building, where historically the quality of teaching simply hasn't been high enough. There's a huge plan there. It was Bill Clinton's phrase, always have a plan for the future. I see it as absolutely crucial to being a reformer. And that's part of the reason, as I say, why I wrote the book. John, I've gone way over my time. Fine.
Well, that was breathless and brilliant. Okay, questions, please. Yep.
My name's Tom and I study in MA at Queen Mary here. I'm a product of the academy system, and I went to Manchester Academy, which was one of the first academies in the country, opened in 2003. It was run by the ULT, Sir Ewan Harper and Dame Angela Rumbell ran it. And I have seen the pros and the cons of an academy system firsthand. And for secondary schools, I completely support what you tried to do and what consequential or subsequential education secretaries have tried to do with the academy system. But what do you think of these rumours as regards primary schools becoming academies, and do you think it's a good idea?
Well, I mean, the Manchester Academy is, if you wanted a sort of textbook case of the case of academies, Ducey High School, which was your school before it became an academy. I mean, you could tell the story of quite what Ducey High School was like. What was it before it became an academy? Was it 2% of the pupils got 2%? I mean, there for 2 years, and then I was there for 3 years prior. It was. That is a sort of, I mean, it's very hard to describe to you quite how bad the bottom end of the comprehensive system was 15 years ago. Failure was the norm. Hardly any pupils got qualifications that we would expect all of our children in this room, the children of all of us in this room, to achieve, and that simply wasn't acceptable. Now, actually, in respect to primary schools, I'm pragmatic. Where you've got a failure of governance, now you tend to have failures of governance less frequently in primary schools than in secondary. They're less complicated organisations to manage. But where you've got a failure of governance, I think the same arguments basically apply. But the people who would be the best sponsors of primary academies are successful primary schools, with go-ahead governors and heads, and almost every local authority has some of those, that are capable of governing and managing more than one school. And federations of primary schools, with the most successful schools taking responsibility for the governance of the least successful, is a model which I think has a lot going for it in primary schools. You're less likely to want to get your big philanthropists or university or big public sector organisations to want to take on the governance for primary schools. So you're going to be more constrained in likely sponsors. But there are a lot of very successful primary schools out there, and enabling them to share their governance success and their leadership success with other schools, which is what the academy model makes possible, I think has a lot going for it.
Yes. Can you just wait for the microphone, please? And could you introduce yourself to the audience?
My name's Hugh Edwards. Thank you for your superb talk. More general point. If I can summarise what you said about ministers generally, they seem to be of three types. One is the ineffective minister, who finds himself out of his depth very quickly in a job. And I've heard of a senior civil servant once tell me he had ministers who said to him, "What do you think I should do about this? Tell me what I think I should do." Just couldn't cope with the job. And the second one is the very effective minister, like Roy Jenkins, Michael Heseltine. But they've got plans, but they're based on rational facts, logic, and conclusions. And you've done a lot of analysis of what on your plans are. And they're prepared to ditch things that don't work. And the more frightening one is the minister who has a completely ideological, theoretical agenda. I mean, examples might be the poll tax. I think you wrote a book about it yourself. Rail privatization, which was pushed through. There were plenty of people who predicted the disaster of rail privatization, and that the fact that it's proved to be a highly expensive, dysfunctional system. And once ideology replaces logic, then you're in deep trouble. For example, there was a man called Alfred Sherman in the early 80s who said, the solution to Britain's transport problems is simple. All you have to do is to close down every railway line and build motorways for buses and lorries only. Because the free market and private ownership will solve the problem for you. The government can just stand back and the magic, the unseen hand. And my worry for the future at the moment, sorry, yes.
Can I have a question, please?
Yeah, that there is a, since 1970, Tony Blair had no ideological baggage as far as I could see. But in the future, this seems to be a very ideological government, and we could be in big trouble if things like 100% privatization of the health service goes ahead, and so on and so forth. And
yeah,
is that
very
going
good.
to be a big change?
You make a very good point. What's interesting about it is, as I listened to you describe the three types of ministers, in my experience, almost every government has ministers of all three varieties within it. In a government, a change of minister is often, in a department, as significant as a change of party. It's often. In transport policy, the change between myself and my predecessor was a very, very radical change in terms of policy. It certainly was in education too. I can think of lots of other examples where that's true. You get ministers of all three types in all governments, and what you want to do is to try and have the ideological ones either in the departments that don't matter at all, or in departments where their ideology is in fact the correct ideology. And that is quite a trick for a Prime Minister to pull that one off. Quite a trick.
Yes, Tim.
My name is Tim Bale. I'm Professor of Politics here at Queen Mary. I very much enjoyed the talk. I was a little bit surprised that you were surprised that politicians reverse engineer the facts. I think that's quite common, actually. But I had two questions. One's for me and one's for my wife, actually, who is a teacher. And the first one has to do with policy transfer, the jargon word for examples from abroad. And I wondered how much you take genuine inspiration from the things that you see when you go overseas or you read about, and how much you simply use them as examples to persuade people of an argument that you already have in your head anyway. That's the question for me. And the question for my wife is about the teacher unions. Are they simply a roadblock to reform, or did anything that they ever said to you, did to you, change policy for the better, even in quite a minor way? You can answer the first question first.
I think there probably is an example. I'm desperately trying to think of it. Actually, I can think of some examples, some quite small ones. Do I see them as roadblocks to reform, though? Actually, I simply took them for granted that they were there. I simply took it for granted, and they were part of what you had to build into the big coalition. I very, very rarely, the only time I would ever criticise the teacher unions were on occasions where they were about to bring the education of children to a halt. Then I felt I had an absolute responsibility to, because you couldn't then duck it. But besides that, I never did. I regarded the best way of dealing with them was either to seek to engage them. I used to meet the teacher union leaders all the time. I've always taken it as, if you're in these jobs, I regard it partly as a matter of responsibility. You must do your absolute level best to bring your opponents on side. I would meet, and often they find it quite disarming, because they would dearly they wish that you wouldn't meet them. I mean, it's much easier to demonise people who you don't meet, and who are impolite to you and all that. But if you meet them, you're polite, you seek to engage and all of that, then that itself is quite a big thing. Also, I had this sort of extraordinary belief that I could persuade them. And actually, do you know what I used to do with teacher union leaders? It's quite interesting, this, is that I would always seek to try and get the conversation onto the education of their own children and their friends. Striking how different the conversation was then than when you talked about, what your view was of policy at large. So I certainly don't, and actually, my experience, because, my other great hero, if I were going back, is Mr. Gladstone, who was probably the greatest Prime Minister this country has produced in the last 2 centuries in terms of modernising the state and actually ensuring a reasonably peaceful transition to representative government. Mr. Gladstone said when he formed his 4th government at the age of whatever it was, 82, I have been a learner all my life. It's part of the reason why he embraced Irish Home Rule. I mean, an extraordinary volte-face in terms of policies that he'd been proposing in even the recent past, but he did so because he was persuaded that the only way of that Britain could, on a consensual basis, continue to govern Ireland was by self-government, and that extraordinary attempt he made, which only it had succeeded, things would have been so different in the 20th century, to produce Irish. And you have to change your mind. One of the things I've changed my mind on is I've become a lot more pro-union over the last 5 years. A lot more, as I see the big problems that we've got with the dominance of this wealth elite and all that has gone with it in society, the real pushing down of real wages, and in what I regard as an increasingly unfair way, particularly in sectors that have got low levels of unionisation. My view is that what we need is modern unions. We shouldn't be anti-union. What we need to do, people like me, particularly those who are on the modernising left, is we need to not regard unions as in any way being opponents. We need to regard them as friends and allies, and we need to be seeking to modernise them in a serious way. That's why, I was so strongly in favour of unions getting much more involved in education, union learning reps, getting training, a big part of what they did. We need modern unions. That's all very important in those areas. I've now forgotten your first question. Oh yeah, travel and absorbing what you see when you're travelling is incredibly important. I got a lot of brilliant ideas from it and tried to be open-minded. And I got some complete policies that just hadn't been properly considered here at all. I mean, to give you an example, we're now converting our motorways to hard shoulder running. This is using the hard shoulder as a running lane, which will, when it's spread across the whole country, produce a 30% increase in motorway capacity. It's a huge reform. The Department for Transport has always been against this. It was my good friend John Speller who told me that it happened in the Netherlands. He came across it because he went to see it, and he persuaded the department to do a pilot on it. Now, my department was very, very strongly against rolling this out further safety concerns. It would involve the rewriting of a lot of operating practices on motorways. The police weren't desperately keen either, because they used the hard shoulder in ways that the police use the hard shoulder, and all that. So I went to the Netherlands to look at it, because John told me, and perfectly safe. Cars do not have catastrophic breakdowns now in the way that they did in the 1950s, which is when the motorways were being built and hard shoulders were being built. And even where they do, actually, because if they do happen, you know, it's possible to get cars off the road with some notice. In almost every case, having regular lay-bys rather than a constant hard shoulder is the right thing to do. I mean, I could go through the list of policies which have been significantly influenced. Actually, my support for high-speed rail, which is the biggest thing I was doing at my last years in government, was basically from absorbing on all my travels for the best part of the last 30 years the fact that almost every other developed Western country either has high-speed rail or has been building it. And I haven't yet met one that wants to rip up the high-speed rail lines and thinks that this was a big mistake. You know, these things, they do make, sometimes it's a kind of subliminal impact. Sometimes you're actually going to study things specifically. There is a danger, of course, of not putting things in their context, and you do need to aim off for that. But sometimes you look at things abroad and you're open-mouthed in awe and wonder, and it really does concentrate your minds on how you can do things better. Finland, which has a brilliant school system, the moment when I realised that we had really, really major challenges is when I was going around this wonderful Finnish Helsinki primary school, and the teachers were telling me they all got master's qualifications, incredibly passionate about their pupils. They do very practical master's courses on things like how you organise special needs for the pupils, all these sorts of things, really, really good. And I said to the head teacher, what's the biggest problem that you have in terms of staff recruitment? And she said to me, Lord Adonis, the biggest problem I have is my best teachers wanting to go off and do doctorates. And I thought, no one has ever said that to me in England. I have never yet met the head teacher. Now, when in 20 years' time, after the next bout of great education reforms, I start meeting head teachers who tell me they've got a really big problem of their best teachers wanting to go off and do doctorates, I know that you know, we've caught up with the Finns.
Okay, now I've got one. Whoa, look, that's ridiculous. When Alistair Campbell came, he took about 30 questions.
Yeah, I'm happy
once.
to carry on, as long as... Actually, if you want to take them in groups, that's
Why
fine.
don't we take it in the group? Okay, first. Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Vanessa. I've just finished a research master's here at Queen Mary. I did my dissertation on the people premium, and a lot of my research revealed that one of the most influential factors contributing to the income educational attainment gap is actually the home learning environment. So I wanted to ask you how far you think the government can intervene in this area and what you think the most effective ways we can do this.
Okay, there's one in the middle there, that's right.
My name is Ifti Hawk. I'm a school teacher and a union representative. The question I wanted to ask was, growing up in Tower Hamlets, we introduced the academy system recently. There's 2 schools that became academies. Before that, the last 10 years, we used the system, building schools for future, where the borough worked in tandem with the local schools to go out and develop or bring in funding from different areas. For example, Sir John Cass School at the back works with Tata in India to bring in funding. Shouldn't that same system be developed in other boroughs? I know it has worked in Staines, where they've worked with local airport, Heathrow, and the BAA Trust to bring in funding. Shouldn't that been taken first before academies?
Thank you. I've got one down the front here.
John Hamlin from a company called Simply Business Skills. That's a shocking statistic about only two applicants per teacher training place. In an ideal world, what sort of people would you like applying for those places to make it 10 or 20 to 1? More fresh graduates through Teach First, industrialists, politicians? What sort of experience would you like in the classroom?
All of the above besides.
Right here, just pass the thing along, that's it.
Hi, I'm Elle Bloomfield. At the beginning, you mentioned free schools. and said you had very strong views on what worked and what didn't work. I'd just be interested in what those are.
Okay. Oh, Christ. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to move over. Brian?
Brian Walker, Constitution Unit. I wonder how you estimate and evaluate the cost of not doing big things. Just two examples, if you would comment on them. One is, what do we do about Hub Airport, third runway, etc.? Presumably you don't have yet another report installed to 2015. And the other thing is, how do we stop the lights going out by about 2020 for want of a proper energy policy?
I feel guilty if I don't let you, Charles. Yeah, there's two over here, please. I want one-word answers from you, Andrew. Right.
Nigel White. I think the first two of your main points on what you should do, one is to come into office with a sort of well-developed policy plan, and the second is to base things on facts. Aren't they contradictory? And can you give any examples of where the facts have actually caused you to change your preconceived ideas?
Just behind you.
Hi, Helen Mitchell. There's quite a lot of movement at the moment in the press, social media, various places for teachers and head teachers who want to take policy making out of the hands of politicians and to put it into the profession. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on why politicians might have such a monopoly on the reform ideas.
Put your running spikes on round that side now. Okay, hands up. Christ, there, one right there, right there.
Hi, my name's Owen Joseph. I was just wondering, with approaching 10% of our children in private education, whether you think this is an impediment to a good state system, and if you know of any countries that manage to combine the both.
Okay, yep, in the middle.
Hi, my name is Raj Jatani. This would be quite an easy one-word answer. As Transport Minister, would you have looked into the West Coast rail line finances yourself or not?
Okay, up here, further up.
John Morbeck, Chairman of the Governors of the Skinner School, a state top 10 grammar school, and you've been very kind in your book at complimenting our sponsorship of the Skinner's Kent Academy. What do those two partners look like in 10 years' time? The grammar school that sponsors and the academy that's successfully being sponsored. What's the fate that lies ahead for both of them?
Okay, is that it? Oh, one down the front here. Yeah, I think so. That's it.
Diane Hopkin. Quite apart from writing off the debts of students, which will enable them to become teachers without carrying debts, which is another story, you did intriguingly actually slip in the third element which makes for success apart from management. You brought in money, and you stressed a lot on that. What will happen, do you think, to the models when the tap of extra money is turned off?
So what would happen
when the tap of extra money, which is going to many of these institutions, actually is turned off? Do you think the model will then work?
So for teachers?
No, for schools.
Schools.
That's it, over to you.
Goodness, there's a lot there. Yes, I would have looked at the finances of the West Coast. And no, I would not have started blaming junior civil servants in advance of there being an inquiry, which I think is, I'll be quite frank, an immoral undertaking. And I think they'll really rue the day that they started blaming and suspending junior civil servants before there's any. I think it's really disgraceful what's happening in respect to the West Coast. And I think that because, you know, those who live by the sword die by the sword, I think there'll be big consequences of this. And it's really not the way that ministers should conduct themselves. So let me just run through them in the order in which they were asked. Pupil premium, yes, of course, home circumstance makes a huge difference. Of course it does. It's part of the reason why I believe in genuinely comprehensive schools. Schools, of course, always have much more chance of succeeding if you can get a genuine social mix. So that you obviously have got a big challenge to deal with families that have got poor education cultures and all of that. The larger the proportion that you've got in the school that's true of course, the tougher the challenge is. And one of my great aims in education reform was to create genuinely comprehensive schools, schools that the community itself does actually want to use, rather than schools which become very socially segregated, with large parts of the community around the school not using, which of course makes things so much more difficult. Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets done great things. I'm a great fan of Tower Hamlets. I could discuss what's happened there in a lot of detail. Trusts are great too. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Some of the trusts are fantastic. You've got some very historic trusts in Tower Hamlets which are kind of essentially academies in the way they operate, have done a fantastic job, and we need more of that too. Graduates, what sorts of graduates, people do we want going into teaching? We want a good cross-section of the most able and motivated people in society, who, of course, are capable of working with and want to work with children. Good graduates, career switchers, it's a very big and important part, people who switch in midway through career. We want them all. If we can get to a situation where we did indeed have 10 applicants per place, in Teach First we've got 7 applicants per place, which is the best that you get in the system at the moment, then of course you can, regardless of different sorts of background and all that, then choose those who are going to be the ones who motivate the children best, which isn't always those who have got the highest qualifications, though you do want in every school. This is very important because it's very important to get this argument right. People think I argue, because I support Teach First, that we just want people with top degrees in schools. I don't believe that at all. You want people who are really good at working with young people. However, in every secondary school, you do need some people who have got top degrees, because otherwise you're not going to get the role models, which is an essential part of what you need on any teaching staff, the role models for the young people to go on to those top universities themselves. What do I think about free schools? I like good free schools. I don't like bad free schools. But it would take quite a long time to explain what I think are good and bad. Not undertaking reforms being it's a particularly serious British disease, that, not doing things that are essential. Now, actually, you gave 2 examples there, which I think are very interesting. You gave airports and energy. I'm confident that we will sort out the energy problem, because no Prime Minister wants to be the Prime Minister who switches the lights off. There'll be alarms and excursions, and you know, there's a brilliant article in last week's Economist about the squeeze that we're undertaking at the moment, that the surplus capacity is busy reducing like mad. We've got this big problem about the decommissioning of coal power stations. We're not commissioning enough and all that. But at the point at which really a Prime Minister is looking at turning the lights off, it doesn't matter what happens, those gas-powered stations will be commissioned. We will put the subsidies in for wind. We will build some nuclear power stations. I'm confident of that. Airports, though, this is the classic problem where governments can fail their nations, is that there's a certain category of things which, by not doing them, you don't lose an election and you don't actually create national crisis, but nonetheless there's a lot of welfare foregone. Heathrow is running at 99% capacity at the moment. It is our gateway to most of the rest of the world, particularly for inward investors, a very high proportion of whom come and set up quite close to Heathrow, and economically it's vital to us. But it would be perfectly possible to carry on for the next 30 years without building another runway there, or even, I mean, it would be perfectly possible for government just to duck building additional runway capacity in London. The world isn't going to end. You know, it will be. There is some capacity in other airports, so you're not going to. It's not going to be a cliff edge type crisis. We still be able to have some flights to the biggest Chinese cities, from Gatwick or Stansted or whatever. But there will be a welfare price that's paid if you don't do that. And actually, you can see that we're capable of doing it by the very fact that Heathrow is our main international hub airport. To give you a fact, you know, and I'll come back to where I'm influenced by the facts in a moment. To give you a fact, my thinking and understanding of why it's so difficult to expand airports came when I was shown a slide, which my officials never showed me. I don't think they had the data. It was shown to me, actually, by an academic who'd done work on comparative airport expansion in different European countries, that showed that if you take international hub airports in Europe, by the number of residents who are affected by noise above 57 decibels, which is the standard definition of very high levels of noise, nearly half of them, across the entirety of Western Europe, live near Heathrow. I then understood, like a blinding flash, why it is so difficult to expand Heathrow. It's not that actually the Germans, the French, the Italians, and all that are so much more far-sighted. It's because we allowed, by a whole process of sins of omission, Heathrow to become the international hub airport, even though it is over densely occupied West London, and does create a really serious, let's be frank, a really serious noise nuisance, and there's no way of getting about it. It does, and for a very large number of people. So you can do these things. Where have I changed my mind? I gave an example, unions. I've radically changed my mind on the importance of unions. I could give you so many others, you know, that I've done too. Most of the issues that Ken Livingstone's been bashing on about, I've sort of changed my mind on too over the years. I think he was right. I mean, including things which are very sensitive in educational terms. It was Ken Livingstone who first did ethnic monitoring of pupils in schools. People like me were very much against this 20 years ago because we regarded this as divide and rule and serious setting of one part of the community against the other. But in fact, it's ethnic monitoring of pupils and the tracking of them that has brought the communities themselves face to face with what's happening in their communities and has brought about a big surge of reform and improvement energy, ethnic community by community, particularly actually in the Black and Caribbean community. It was Ken who was there. It was people like me who were against those. You know, the list is as long as my arm of issues where I've changed my mind. You have to be as honest as you can in this business, but of course that doesn't mean to say that you don't have prejudices. Of course you do, and you bring those to bear too. Skinner's, fantastic company. You do brilliant work in education. What would I like to see happen between the Skinner's Academy? For those of you who don't know, the Skinner's Academy, this is one of those great reforms I talk about in the book. Kent, you still have grammar schools and secondary moderns. The grammar schools are by and large brilliant. The secondary moderns are by and large not brilliant. They've got really serious problems. One of the things I'm very keen to see happen is that this is, because we're not going to abolish selection in Kent, at least it's unlikely. It's not going to happen anytime soon. So, dealing with the world as it is, what should we seek to do? Systematically to partner the grammar schools and the secondary modern schools and get the grammar schools to take a real sense of responsibility, particularly for post-16 education, because the bane of secondary modern schools is the absence not only of sixth forms, but the absence of any proper trajectory for the pupils going on beyond 16, which is what you're doing so brilliantly at the Skinner's Academy and in partnership with the grammar school. What would I like to see happen? The schools to grow as steadily closer together. And who knows, as they grow steadily closer together, more joint activities, I would hope possibly a joint sixth form, things of this kind, who knows where it might end up. But it needs to start somewhere. Where it started is by Skinner's as a company taking responsibility for the governance of what was a secondary modern school, which now no longer thinks of itself as a secondary modern at all. It has huge pride in having the Skinner's label. It has the same label as the grammar school. There's lots of joint activities. Those mentors you've got from the grammar school who've been acting as teaching assistants in the academy, that has been transformational. I met all the mentors. I was in Oxford 2 weeks ago and a group of the mentors were there and I met them. This has been transformational for them as students and former students at the grammar school, and of course it's done great things for the pupils. That's what we need to happen. And it's by, you know, what you need if you're going to be coming back to this big theme you wanted me to talk about, is reform is about big principles and big reforms, but getting the detail right, institution by institution, community by community, that is incredibly important too. And there's no other way of doing it than by applying yourself or having people who do apply themselves case by case. And what you've done in the case of Skinner's, not just in Tunbridge Wells, but also in Hackney too, with your academy there, is transformational. And if I can end on this point, if we had in this country 1,000 organisations like the Skinner's, dedicated in the way that you are as a charitable enterprise to bringing about educational transformation, our education problems would be over and we would be a genuine one-nation society.
Thank you very much. 5 points. Number one, I am sorry that we've gone over time. I don't blame you for that. I take full responsibility. Number two, next Tuesday we will be at Mile End for Mile End Group 89 with Bill Keegan launching his new book on saving the world, question to which the answer is no. Gordon Brown Reconsidered. Number three, there is a reception outside. Please come and do join us. Number four, you'll be able to buy books and you will sign some. Number five, I'm sure you'll agree with me that was quite wonderful. And as a proud product of the comprehensive system, I think what you're doing and what you've done is wonderful. Thank you, Andrew.